Hello, and welcome to the Isle of Wight Family History Society Zoom presentations. I'm Jeff Allen, Chairman of the Society. This presentation is by Damon Corr and will give some aspects of the history of firefighting on the Isle of Wight. Damon has prepared this list of 49 topics he could talk about, and as we go through this talk, send me a chat message with the topic and Damon can expand on it. Damon Corr, who is a firefighter on the island. I think Damon can probably explain for himself, but he has researched extensively the history of the fire services on the island. I'm interested to wonder what was going on in AD300, but I will now just pass straight over to Damon. And Damon, you should be able, I'm going to stop my screen share and you should then be able to share your screen with your presentation.
Look.
That's good.
Okay. Right, off we go then. Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you everybody for the invite to speak with you this evening. It's the first time I've done this online, so I hope it goes well. I've had to slightly amend the concept, but I'm sure it'll all work out. And we've already got some requests for subjects as we go through, so that's really good. So my name's Damon. I've been in the Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service for 25 years. Most of that time on the trucks, and very early on in that career, I was always interested in history, and it became natural to me to want to know more about the profession that I'd entered, and that was where it all started, literally within months of joining the service, and it hasn't really stopped, I'm pleased to say, because there's always something new to discover. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through some introductory slides, and then usually what I do if I'm in person somewhere, I hand out some sheets with numbers 1 to 49 and some titles on and get people to shout out what they want to hear. Well, it's slightly different here, but a lot of people have already said which titles they'd like to hear about, so we'll do it that way tonight. So just clicking on, if this works, yeah, there we are. Right. As I said, in my research, I've obviously discovered a heck of a lot of things about firefighting on the Isle of Wight. One of the most profound of which was the discovery of the Isle of Wight's Fire Brigades Federation, which existed between 1894 and 1945. You see a chap in a red circle, hopefully, as long as you're seeing the same screen that I am. And he founded the IWFBF, as it was generally known. And his name's Charles Langdon. Anybody that knows David Langdon of Ryde, he's his great grandfather, and like David, was a builder by trade, and much of the architecture that still remains in Ryde today is owed to the Langdons of the Victorian period. But in addition to that, Charles was captain of Ryde Fire Brigade, only for a relatively short period. But within that period, he established the Isle of Wight Fire Brigades Federation. And there's a good reason why, I'll explain in a moment. So the Isle of Wight Fire Brigades Federation, I kind of anchored as my platform for the books, which are pictured on the left-hand side, all of which just raises funds for the Firefighters charity, which is just particular to my profession and a charity that I've got a lot of respect and time for. I'll just click on the next slide. So a quick slip through the timeline. Jeff just mentioned he'd like to know what happened in AD300, but we'll go back a little bit before the timeline that I put on the screen to AD64, the Great Fire of Rome. Without wasting too much time on Monty Python-esque, what did the Romans ever do for us? Well, they actually did quite a lot. They're a very organised bunch, and that included the provision of the first firefighters in this country. They experienced a tremendous fire in AD 64 and brought their skills with them in all manners, including firefighting. In AD 300, some pirates sacked Brading Villa and set light to it. Now, this is complete supposition on my part, but I imagine if the Romans, being organised as they were busy battling with the pirates in one aspect, but battling with the flames in the other. And there's a nice connection that follows that red line right through from AD 300 until today. And that's a simple tool which today we call a ceiling hook. The Romans invented it, and it would have been much larger because they'd have used it to actually tear buildings down to create fire breaks. And I like to think that perhaps in AD300 they had one of those present at Brading during that fire. And those tools are still very much in use today. Every fire engine that you see, certainly on the Isle of Wight, has got at least two on board, and they get regular use. There's a huge gap in the history of organised firefighting after the dismemberment of the Roman Empire, and more of that will come up later on in the talk. But in terms of responsibility for fire protection and firefighting, it was very, very loose. As the country went through the industrial era and became more successful as an empire, many things were developed. And the government were put under pressure from many angles to nationalise the fire service to protect these assets that the country was steadily building. But they resisted. They didn't wish to do so. And as a result, as you will see from the talk later on, everything was very disparate as far as fire brigades were concerned. The metropolitan cities, where the real value was, tended to be better organised and loosely regulated. But out here in the provinces, there was no such regulation, and nothing really changed until the impending Second World War, when the Air Raid Precautions Act came out in 1937, which invoked the Auxiliary Fire Service, and they worked alongside the brigades. And the brigades in those days were parish, town, or borough, and largely of volunteers. Some of them got paid, some didn't, and there was no real connection between them, apart from here on the Isle of Wight, thanks to Charles Langdon, because he created the Federation, where they all got together and shared ideas and experiences. The first nationalised act came out in 1938. That was the Fire Brigades Act, at which then local authorities were tasked with providing a certain level of fire protection in their communities. That all changed again in 1941, so things are moving very quickly as a result of poor organisation, certainly not lack of effort, but poor organisation between the disparate brigades and the Auxiliary Fire Service, particularly in the lessons learned during the Blitz. So the National Fire Service was formed in 1941. After the war, then we had the Fire Services Act, which stayed with us for a very, very long time until 2004 and guided everything that we did. That gave birth to the Isle of Wight County Fire Brigade, the first time the island had an island-wide brigade in 1948. And in the late 80s, that was changed to the Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service, which was really just a change of name and a cat badge. And 1 month from today, another piece of history, when we merged with Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service and become Hampshire and Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service. So we're just on the cusp of another important piece of island firefighting history. So that just gives you an idea of where we are. The important thing to note is that prior to 1938, there was no regulation to provide any fire brigade or firefighting facility whatsoever here on the Isle of Wight and several other places. So normally I'll just dwell on this slide, but I won't, because we're changing things slightly for tonight. That's a slide I will use when I come to it. But what I'm going to do now, I'm going to jump straight into some of the subjects that you asked for. And I'm going to go to number 15. Somebody asked to hear about Colin Weeks. It's a good place to start because this is where my research started. I joined in the winter, so we come out to the winter of 1996. And somebody who is now a very old friend, who I'd only just met at the time, he gauged my interest in history and my wish to gain more knowledge about the fire service. He advised that I went upstairs at Ryde Fire Station, which was very new at the time, only been open about a year, and have a look through a box of bits and bobs that were brought from the old station in Station Street. Well, in that box, I found a binder, which you can see on the screen over towards the right-hand side, which instantly caught my eye when I opened it up, because it contained lined pages, but those pages had actually been typed on. And the first page said, "My War Diary" by Colin Weeks, dedicated to my colleagues in the fire service. And I sat there one evening and read the whole thing from cover to cover. and found that the very final line stopped mid-sentence, which was very frustrating. It was because it was a wonderful read, citing local places, but in a context that certainly for my generation, it was very different, something hard to imagine, particularly with his description of some of the raids, some of which I was dubious about at first when he said thousands of incendiary bombs were dropped, until I researched and discovered that that was feasible and did happen in the St John's Park area of Ryde at the time. And it led me into this whole process that I've done over the last, over 20 years now. So Fireman Colin Weeks was at the root of that. Now, at the time, my station officer was a chap called Dave Potts. He was a fourth generation in his family who served in Ryde. And so I went to him and said, Dave, why does that diary end mid-sentence? Have you any idea why? And he explained the story. Colin was the teenage son of the mayor of Ryde during the war. There's Henry William Oscar Weeks. You can see him there on the lower left-hand side. And that's a picture of young Colin up above him that was sent to me by a member of his family who now lives in Scotland. Colin was 17 at the time that his father, the mayor, called him into his chamber. And as he wrote in his diary, he had this feeling of, oh no, what have I done now? Well, what his father was keen to do was to get him to do his bit for the war. And the chief officer of Ryde Fire Brigade needed a clerk, and Colin was very skilled in that type of administrative work. So he cajoled Colin to go to the fire station, the temporary fire station as it was at the time in Edward Street, which is where the photograph was taken on the motorcycle, and to go and report to the chief and become his new clerk. At the time, he wrote in his diary that he had an aversion for firefighting, had no interest in it, and quite a fear of it. But that changed within a few months of being in the environment, and he first became a dispatch rider, a messenger, and later actually trained as a firefighter as well. The reason his diary ended mid-sentence was because sadly he was one of two Ryde firefighters that were killed together during the Cows Blitz early in the morning of the 5th of May 1942. And having discovered that, then that just opened up my enthusiasm even more to understand what it was like to be a firefighter in times gone by in situations that I can't really imagine. So this is Colin. Colin is the roots of everything I've done from there. So I won't dwell any longer on Colin because he may pop up again later in another context. I think what I'll do at this point, Jeff, you gave me some numbers that other people had offered up. So I think I'll move on to number 20. Let me just negotiate. Number 20, which should be something to do with Newport. Ah, yes, of course. Right. I'm going to refer to some notes. It's been some time. I used to be able to do this whole thing off the top of my head, but it's been some time due to the lockdown. So I'm going to refer to some notes as I go. This refers to an incident in the High Street in Newport. And if you look at the engraving, the image of the engraving, which appeared in the Daily Graphic, you can see through a gap where there was a building that collapsed. You can see the Guildhall. So you can get some idea of where you are, where you're looking, or where the artist was looking at the time. This particular incident, 1892, May 28th, began at 01:30, and it was a Saturday morning. So it was middle of the night. Police Sergeant King wandered around the corner on his beat from the Guildhall and sniffed something on the air. And it was him that first noticed that Mr. Wall's supply store, as it was alight in the store. And as was the case for nearly all business proprietors at the time, he and his family resided in the floors above. And the same with the shops either side. And this was quite a well-developed fire by all accounts by the time Police Sergeant King had identified it. So he woke the Walls family. They were able to evacuate quite safely. But the fire soon took a hold and began to penetrate the shops on either side, which were operated by Mr. Varty and Mr. Gentle. I've seen some photographs of the time. Mr. Gentle's sign was quite prominent in the High Street. You couldn't miss it there opposite the town hall. And they too needed to evacuate. Some did, but by the skin of, I beg your pardon, they all did, but some by the skin of their teeth. Now, towards the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a modern photograph of a very old manual fire engine. This is on display at the training centre where I work. So every day when I go to work, I go in the doors and pass this wonderful old restored fire engine. It is the authentic one, the real one that served Newport at the time and was present at this fire in 1892. As good as it was for its time, it was wholly incapable of providing enough flow of water to fight the fire that the Newport firefighters were trying to deal with at the time. And they sent to the barracks up at Parkhurst and 2 companies of the King's Royal Rifles under Pioneer Sergeant Keevil attended the incident and assisted the firemen. The soldiers went round to the back, so they would have been pretty much looking at the view in the image on the left, whilst the Fire Brigade were to the front, which was very convenient response for them because the fire station at that time was in the Guild Hall, so they didn't have far to go when they initially responded to the fire. Between them, they eventually got on top of the fire, but not before some very close scrapes, including when the plate glass shot out of Mr. Varty's store at some point where there were men working beneath it, and also the collapse of the fire of origin, Mr. Wall's store, was a spectacular event by all accounts, but fortunately on this occasion nobody was seriously hurt. However, it did require a complete rebuild of that particular part of the town hall. The fire engine itself, I say, was inadequate for that level of fire, but was thankfully kept all these years. I won't dwell too much on that now, but it was allowed to go to rack and ruin twice and restored twice in the intervening period. And as you can see, we now very proudly look after it and polish it, but don't use it for pumping anymore at the training centre. So that's the story from the High Street in Newport. And it's very typical of the time to see a fire which has outrun the capability of not the individuals, but certainly the machinery available in the late Victorian era. Now, somebody also asked for more about Newport, so that's what we'll do, I think, was it 21, I think? Okay, we're going to go back a few years here to 1850. That fire engine I was talking about then didn't exist in Newport at the time. So we're going back to an even more crude form of firefighting and a substantially larger fire. Parkhurst Juvenile Reformatory. This one occurred in the small hours, as the worst fires always seem to do, in C Ward of the Juvenile Reformatory, which was a block measuring approximately 200 feet by 25 of 3 stories in height, with about 200 inmates inside, and teenage inmates inside. So rapidly did the fire take hold that the warders actually encouraged the inmates to break their own way out. And incredibly, given the situation, they were all able to do so. No lives were lost in this fire. What I do like about this particular engraving, which appeared in the London Illustrated News, is it's even got the little firefighters up their ladders on top of the roof. Hopefully you can just see a little red mark I put on the screen showing you where they are. And then down here at the bottom, you've got the inmates which were corralled by soldiers from the barracks. The barracks didn't just bring soldiers for security, they also brought 2 manual fire engines that were based there, and 2 came from the House of Industry just across the road. This was very typical of the time. There were several incidents both at the barracks, at the workhouse, and in the town around this period, and they all tended to support each other. There was nothing formally organised between them. It just seemed to be the done thing, that if there was a fire and had the capability, then they would bring their engines and people to operate them. Those that operated them from the workhouse were the inmates from the workhouse, and they certainly dealt with some interesting fires over the years, including this one. This one took 28 hours for the combined forces of 1 town engine, 2 from the barracks and 2 from the workhouse to get on top of. but not before Seaward had totally collapsed in on itself. And according to the report that appeared in the Illustrated News, just left a mass of molten metal at the base where 200 iron bedsteads had once been. So it was quite a devastating fire, but incredibly, nobody was hurt. So we'll move on. I'll just take a quick swig of water because I don't want to dry up. Okay, so we've jumped into the next century, and we're at the Star Hotel in Newport now. But there is a military connection because the landlord was a former sergeant major, a chap called Walker, who was present in his licensed establishment on this evening, 23rd of August 1910, with his 15-year-old daughter. Probably fortunate that his wife and 4 other children were staying with relatives in Southsea at the time. Sergeant Major Walker's army record is littered with sporting achievements. He was certainly a keen sportsman on many fronts. But by this time he was a pub landlord and had probably relaxed a little bit more into the life of an innkeeper. This particular fire was spotted at 01:45, quarter to 2 in the morning, by a Mr. Emery of Chain Lane, who was on his way home. Where he was going home from at that time of morning, who knows? But he spotted some glowing from inside behind the windows and banged on the doors to wake the family, which was, as I say, Mr. Walker, his daughter, and the barmaid who lived in one of the rooms, the upper rooms. The barmaid was very rapid in her response and dashed through smoke and some considerable heat to collapse on the pavement, where she was recovered and survived. But Mr. Walker, by the time he had gathered his 15-year-old daughter, discovered that it was impassable. The stairway was impassable. Having great presence of mind, he decided the best thing to do would be to make their way to the roof, which they did, and they broke through a skylight onto the roof and sat on the ridge. Unfortunately for them, the fire soon followed them, and as you can see, the fire's penetrated the roof. And the wind direction wasn't in their favour either. So by the time Newport Fire Brigade responded and pitched the escape ladder to get them down, they were virtually blinded by the combination of the heat and the smoke. Not permanently, thankfully, but it was extremely difficult for Fireman Denham and Fireman Murcell to get them down from that position, bearing in mind that they really had no vision because of what they'd suffered. Newport Fire Brigade were, of course, celebrated for saving their lives and perhaps in some contexts even more so for preventing widespread destruction, which was often the real fear of a fire in town, because fire breaks and building design were not quite as they are today. The risk of any fire in the town was that it would spread and just keep on spreading. And given the very crude nature of the firefighting apparatus available at the time, it must have been extremely difficult for them to get a sufficient flow of water to fight a fire of that size. At this time, Newport were under the command, well, they were for a very long time, of a chap called Nicholas Henry Thomas Murcell. He was the landlord of the Castle Inn in the High Street for 50 years, from about 1893 until just after, or the sort of middle of the war, when he retired and went to Bournemouth and lived with his son. He was a much celebrated member of Newport Fire Brigade and eventually its captain come chief officer. That raises an interesting question, actually, captain or chief officer. There was a bit of both going on. Like I said, up until the first act of 1938, there was no organisation nationally of the fire service. So you will find that between different brigades, there were different ranks and different structures and different epaulets, different markings. There's very little continuity between the brigades. So you may see different pictures throughout this process and think, well, he's a chief, but why doesn't he dress like the other one? That's because there was no normal before 1938. Okay, I'm just crossing things off so I don't go back on them. Have a quick swig of water again. I think we're going to leap straight into The controversy of Dr. Hastings' cat. People tend to like this one. I'm just going to flick my notepad over for any specific details I need, but I don't need to remember much of this really, because this story stays with me. This occurred on the 28th of August, or there was a fire that occurred on the 28th of August 1882 in John Street, Wight. The photograph in front of you, not the comical cat, but the house, is as photographed by myself recently. It's Lansdowne House. Looks very grand today, and I'm sure it did in 1882. At the time, it was the home of Dr. Hastings, his wife, and a servant girl, and they went to bed, and as always, it's a fire that breaks out in the middle of the night that creates pandemonium. Mrs. Hastings was the first to sense that something was wrong, and she went to climb out of bed and promptly hopped back into bed when her bare feet met the floorboards and discovered that they were extremely hot. She woke her husband, and between them they began to evacuate, which they were able to successfully do through a smoke-laden stairwell. As they came downstairs, Dr. Hastings grabbed up an ornate Chinese gong that he had in the hall, dragged it out the front, and banged it like crazy to get some attention. It worked, and he got the attention of the local police. The police were on the beat in those days, as they I guess they are today. One of the policemen in the high street ran to John Street and then had to run back to the police station, which at the time was in Brunswick Street, as it was known, before changing it to Station Street, where he woke the police superintendent, who then had to set off the alarms that woke up the chief fire officer, or Captain Bucket, as we know him. He then had to get his men together, and all this process took a long time. There was no immediate alerting system like we have today, and even with the crashing of church bells, which were used on occasions, it's incredible how many people would still sleep through it. And so they used to use young boys, what they called knockers up, to run around and hammer on the doors of firemen. And usually the firemen of the brigades in those days would have a sign above their door quite clearly stating that they were a fireman. And it would be up to the young lads to run off into their particular districts and hammer on the doors and wake these chaps up and get them to come in. The fire station in Wight at the time was at the rear of the town hall in Market Street, so they wouldn't have had too far to go. And they manually handled their fire engine, very similar to the one I showed you just now from Newport. They manually handled that up the hill and into John Street to begin fighting the fire. The captain at the time at Ryde was Henry Bucket, and he took his first team of men in through the front doors to fight the fire, which was in the drawing room. Unfortunately, I don't know which room was the drawing room, but I know it was one of the doors directly off the hallway as they entered, so presumably one of those front rooms on the ground floor. He went in with his men with a hose to begin fighting the fire, and by all accounts it was a bit of a struggle because of the heat and the smoke. And in those days, before any sort of breathing apparatus, the only option was to just crawl along the floor and try and find fresh air where you could. And in doing so, they came across a forlorn cat. Now, this cat was Mrs. Hastings' pride. Unfortunately, we don't know its name. I really wish I could tell you its name. I'd like to know myself, but I can't. But they found the cat. The cat was not in a good state, and Captain Bucket took it out, put it by the front door to let it get some fresh air, which very quickly revived the cat. It was just needed some fresh air to clear its lungs. Superintendent Hinks of Ryde Borough Police scooped the cat up from where Captain Bucket had left it, and then took it to Mrs. Hastings, who was eternally grateful, very relieved that despite the loss of things in their home, she hadn't lost her precious cat. So she was very happy. This incident is unremarkable in itself. The fire brigade got inside, managed to restrict the fire to the drawing room, although it was so hot that there were items on the other side of the wall in the library which were affected by the heat, but the fire itself didn't spread. So it was considered a good stop. That's what we tend to call it in the fire service since the 1860s, and we still do today. We call it a good stop. And they packed up, and as far as the fire brigade were concerned, that was that. A few weeks later, Dr. Hastings decided, having been in possession of his insurance money, to grant some thank yous to both the police and the fire brigade, and £5 each was sent to Captain Bucket and Superintendent Hinks. Superintendent Hinks didn't want his £5 in cash. He opted for something else, but Captain Bucket took his £5 and divided it equally among those that were in his brigade that attended the fire that night. And then it was discovered that Superintendent Hinks had kept the value of his £5 and asked the doctor to buy him a marble clock. And this was presented to him at the restored and repaired house, Dr. Hastings' house, at a special occasion in which he was also awarded an RSPCA illuminated address for saving the cat's life. When this was reported in the local papers, I think it was the Isle of Wight Observer, it incensed a lot of the fire brigade, and some bad feeling developed between the police and the fire brigade as a result, and also between various members of the borough police and their superintendent after they discovered that he was offered £5 that he could have shared like Captain Bucket did with the firefighters, but chose instead to get himself a marble clock. And this bad feeling went on for some time throughout the reign of Captain Bucket, who actually seemed to enjoy goading the police and keeping this little battle going between them. And it really didn't end until he retired and handed over to Charles Langdon, who we spoke about earlier, who then started to put things back together, which is a good 7 years of bad feeling. And it all started with Mrs. Hastings' cat. So that's the story of the controversy of the cat. I'll just strike that one off the list and see where we go on to next. Because if you've got eyes on the list and anything catches your eyes, then as Jeff said, let him know, and I'm sure he'll tell me if there's anything in particular. But I know somebody asked for number 23. So here we are. Let me strike that one off as well. Newport Fire Station, July the 11th, 1942. The station, if you look at these images, you'll see that the 5-bay ground floor part of the fire station has not changed one little bit. It's been added to in the 1960s, but those 5 bays haven't changed, and probably explains why we have such difficulty reversing our enormous fire engines into those spaces created for Austins, 70 odd years ago. But this particular event, coming just a few months after the station opened, was to present to the National Fire Service on the island at the time the mobile kitchen you can see on the lower left image. You can't see the writing to the left-hand side of the mobile kitchen, but what it tells you is that this was donated, not the cost of it was donated by a union of railway workers in Argentina. They wished to show their gratitude for the way people from the Isle of Wight treated some Argentinian sailors that became stricken off the coast of the island some years before. And this was their way of doing so. It was part of a wider initiative, but I think it's quite sweet the way that this was done. Most of these kitchens that were deployed on the, in the UK came from America or funded by America and Canada, but this particular one is the only one that I know of that was funded from South America, and it all came because of what the island people had done for the Argentinian sailors some years before, and this kitchen was to get a lot of use in the certainly the next 12 to 18 months at various incidents. And it was presented in a formal ceremony, and I think there's a lot more I can say about that one. Actually, I'm just going to go back to my notes. I'm going to say, excuse me for being a little bit rusty on this. It's been a while. No, I think we'll leave that there for that one. You can't really ask questions. You're all on mute, aren't you? This is a very strange one-way conversation. That's the bit I'm finding hard to get used to, so bear with it. Right, just strike that one off. I think 20, yeah. I mentioned number 30, which is the Parish Brigades, right? Yeah. Okay. Like I said, there was no formal organisation. If you lived in a settlement that decided it wanted a fire service prior to 1938, you just got on and did what you thought was best with what little funding you had. The image in front of you, which I've attempted to improve digitally because it was quite rough, is Roxul. And the keen-eyed among you can probably spot there's a fire station hidden in amongst that lot, somewhere near the left-hand, lower left-hand corner. Briefly the home of the Roxul Volunteer Fire Brigade, which came about in May 1901. It had been in the offing for some time before that. In fact, March 1900, it was brought to the table in the parish council, but Mr. Flux said no, we don't need the expense of a fire service. And then in just over 12 months later, he suffered a fire at his farm, lost a considerable amount of stock and produce, and at the next meeting decided, actually, yes, we do need a fire brigade, and established Roxul Fire Brigade, Roxul Volunteer Fire Brigade, from among the men, mainly the men that worked the land, and that remained in place until the 1920s. One of the few of the smaller brigades that did, but it was joined by others. We had small similar brigades at Newchurch, Northwood, at Binstead, under Captain Cleaver, and they were famous in their time for being barely equipped, but they actually saved the school from an otherwise devastating fire using little more than buckets and beaters. And then there were non-parish brigades, but small brigades also in existence at Apley Towers in Ryde, and or on the outside of Ryde, and at Osborne House. Osborne House also had its own fire brigade throughout this period. The Roxul Brigade and the Northwood Brigade in particular were among the parish brigades the most notable. They were the only two out of the parish brigades that affiliated to the Isle of Wight Fire Brigades Federation and took part in drill competitions, which happened every year. And because of the nature of the way they worked, they didn't have a fire engine as such. They had a cart carrying hose and a standpipe to fix to a very crude form of hydrant called a fire plug, and were able to work from there, or possibly just using buckets and beaters, similar to what I was saying in Binstead. So it was very crude, but if they got there quick enough, could be very effective. And in a small village, that was often the case. So that's the parish brigades. I say there were probably 7 of them in full strength. Some only lasted a couple of years, but Roxul lasted for almost 20 and were quite celebrated at the time for their achievements, because Roxul's response when they, or before the parish brigade or after it closed, was dependent on Ventnor, which in the time before the we had the combustion engine petrol driven fire engines over to respond. It was obviously a long wait before Ventnor could get there to come to your help. So that's the parish brigades. Just strike that off and jump back to number 39. Somebody asked for, what was that? The railway firefighters. Okay, yeah, there's another angle of firefighting. It's one thing I've tried to do. When I first started this project, I was interested in the history of Ryde Fire Brigade, and then it expanded very quickly to Ireland when I discovered the IWFBF. And then I realised that the local authority fire brigades were by far, or weren't by far the only firefighters on the island. And certainly prior to the war, and for some time afterwards, there were a lot of other firefighting units here. The railways were predominant among that, not just for their numbers, but for their level of organisation. The first photograph, the larger photograph you see in front of you, must have been taken prior to December 1922, because on the side of the hose cart, as it's called, you can see the letters of the London South Western and London Brighton South Coast Railway, which became Southern Railway after that. So that must have been taken prior to December 1922. And this is at Ryde Pierhead. You can just about make out Ryde Pier through the spokes of the wheels. And these chaps, as you can see, they're not full-time firefighters. Well, there were no full-time firefighters on the island prior to 1938. They had other jobs, and when the need arose, they would participate in any firefighting that needed doing at the end of the pier. And this, at the end of the pier, lasted for a considerable period into the 1960s, because the picture on the right-hand side is the Pierhead Southern Railway team that in 1960, 61 and 65 won the Regional Shield in drill competitions on the mainland. And in 1963, on the 11th of May, they staged the competition actually on the pierheads. Hard to imagine now, but they actually had some real fires at the wet end of the pier for the purpose of this competition. Fires in trays and fires involving wooden boxes and such like, and held a competition there in which the star of the show was a 19-year-old Janice Etheridge of Newport, who worked in the office at Newport, and she teamed up with Elizabeth Bennett of Ryde, who worked at the pierhead, and they actually won the extinguishing competition. And it got quite a feature in the county press at the time. And from chatting with a local fireman who was operational in Ryde at the time, it was quite something that these two teenage young ladies had won this competition. And you can imagine in the 1960s, that must have been quite something. Somebody asked for Apsley Towers. Apsley Towers. This is one of my favourites, actually, Apsley Towers. It was one of the earliest reports I discovered, and I've managed to find quite a few different angles to this story. Apsley Towers estate was pretty much, if you know it, where Marina Avenue is as you drive out towards Puckpool from Ryde at the moment. And other than the few bits of brickwork in the lodge house, there is nothing left of it. It looks very grand in its day. And it was the home, at the time of this fire, it was the home of Captain George William Hutt, who lived 1865 to 1910. His father was a Major General who died at Apsley in 1889. And his uncle was Sir William Hutt, who was a commissioner in South Australia and pretty much in charge of the colonising of New Zealand at the time, or the civilising of New Zealand at the time. So a very powerful family. But George William Hutt wasn't quite on the same level with the rest of his family. He was a reserve captain in the Royal Scots, the Royal Scots, which is how he obtained his title of captain. But spent most of his life on the island and hadn't achieved anything like the rest of his family. But he seemed very keen on firefighting. So we're going back several years before this fire, and then we'll come back to the fire. But George had appealed to St Helens Urban District Council time and time again that it was necessary for St Helens to form a fire brigade. And they resisted that because of the cost. And like I say, there was no nationalised requirement, there was no regulation, nobody was telling them they had to do it, and so there was a sort of general acceptance in local politics that a certain amount of loss could be acceptable, and it took incidents of a particular nature to change that in many quarters. But St Helens resisted for a long time, and Captain Hutt was very keen to do something. So he formed the Apsley Towers Volunteer Fire Brigade. How voluntary they were is debatable because they were made up of his own estate staff. So I imagine that he was quite keen that they played their part. But nevertheless, they were the first fire brigade in St Helens, because all of this area of what is now Ryde, St John's Park, etc., was all part of St Helens at the time. So Ackley was in that. And he was in trouble in 1894 with the district council for using hydrants in the district to train his crew, or more importantly, using the water. But he maintained his volunteer fire brigade, and naturally they were the first to respond to this fire. Now, this afternoon, March 22nd, 1904, his wife, Caroline, had decided to go horse riding. So she mounted her steed and trotted off and noticed some smoke in the air, but thought nothing of it, just considered it must have been a bonfire nearby. In actual fact, it was the beginnings of a fire in the house, which was first spotted by some of the domestic servants. The interesting thing about this is that Captain Hutt was so determined to be a commander of a fire brigade that even with his own home burning down, he took the time to go and don his uniform from somewhere within the burning property and then come back outside and command his volunteer fire brigade. In 1956, the Isle of Wight Women's Institute published a book called, I think it was called The Isle of Wight in Living Memory, if I remember right. There's a really interesting part in there that a lady contributed. She must have been quite young at the time, 1904, but in 1956 she recalled this day very well. But what she recalled was that the captain of Ryde Fire Brigade was very smartly dressed and a little portly, and then his name was Captain Hutt, and he sort of marched up and down instructing his men. But actually he wasn't the captain of Ryde Fire Brigade. Ryde Fire Brigade, who attended, were under Captain Sidney Charles Sapsworth. The same young lady was present when Captain Sapsworth, decided he needed more men at this incident, and so he sent messengers to Sandown, Shanklin and Newport, and she was present on Marlborough Road when Bertie Meerman, who was the horseman, the coach driver, came through from Sandown with their fire engine and, in her words, 4 matching roans, tearing down Marlborough Road in thunderous fashion with the horses snorting, and it must have been quite a sight and quite an exciting ride. I can't imagine what that must have been like. But they arrived, so by then we had Captain Hutt's own brigade, we had Ryde, we had Sandown, Shanklin and Newport all at this fire. One of the Ryde firemen, what's his name? Mr. Williams. Fireman Williams was one of those that went aloft to actually saved the life and was commended for doing so of a member of the domestic staff, one who had gone in to fight the fire and became entrapped and needed saving. And before this, well, after these pictures were taken and before the end of the incident, pretty much everything at the top level had collapsed in on itself. Apparently the only thing that saved the rest of the building was a substantial concrete floor, quite unusual at the time, between the ground floor and the first floor. But other than that, everything above that was pretty much destroyed, but was rebuilt. And sadly, the place was demolished for good in the 1950s, but it was rebuilt at the time. And Captain Hutt, having suffered this fire, was then empowered to go back to St Helens Urban District Council and say, look, I've been telling you for years we need a fire brigade. Look what's just happened to my home, it could happen to yours. Naturally, they then took notice, and within a very short space of time, St Helens formed what was, in the pre-1938 period, the biggest fire brigade that was present on the Isle of Wight in that period. It was made up of 3 elements: St Helens proper, based near the Green, Seaview, and St John's. And Captain Hutt was made the commander of the St John's element of the brigade. And ironically, during their period of tenure, it seems to be one of the quietest period of fires that St Helens had ever had. But nevertheless, they had the safety net of it should they have needed it. Sadly, not long after being made captain, George William Hutt passed away, was quite unwell. But he was very well thought of, particularly for the way that he looked after his men and invested a lot of his own money to buy them the latest uniforms. And there was a little bit of jealousy between the three elements of the St Helens Brigade, because it was quite evident that the St John's element were very well equipped compared to Seaview and St Helens proper. Right, I've now, Jeff, used up every number that people have mentioned earlier. Has anyone come up with any more?
Yes, there's one more, and it's likely that it could take you some time. So I think we'll do this one and then ask for any further questions. So okay. We're talking now about Cowes Blitz, number 16, which I imagine is quite a large subject.
Yeah, this is one of those you could almost make a TV series about, to be honest. Well, it goes back to where I started with this. It was the incident at which Colin Weeks sadly perished in the early hours of the 5th of May. So let me just go back to my notes, just so I get some timings right. It took me a long time to really fathom out the chronological story of what happened on this night, until I managed to access at the National Archives the original report produced by Captain Frankie of the Polish Navy. And I'm sure everybody's aware of the wonderful effort that the Polish sailors put in with their guns on this particular night. But they also did a lot more in terms of saving life and assisting the firefighting. But also they weren't the only ones. The Free French Navy based at Marvin's Yard were equally active. But we'll just go back a tad. 2 days before this fire, Colin Weeks, on his BSA motorcycle, was sent to Bembridge Fire Station. Now, Bembridge Fire Station, thankfully, even after all these years, still have a complete original handwritten log of every single day of operation of the National Fire Service. And so I know by checking their log that Colin Weeks went there 1 day, the 3rd of May. He went there on the 3rd of May on motorcycle just to drop off some routine dispatches. It was his usual task given to him by Captain Heller. He went from Ryde, popped to Binstead, where there was an action station, went to the proper fire station in Station Street, went down to one in Simeon Street, went out to Seaview, and then to Bembridge, because that was all part of what was at the time known as the District 2. When he was at Bembridge, he was questioned by Mr. Weaver and the other firemen there. Most of the firemen at Bembridge worked for the Weavers. They virtually shut their business down whenever they got a call out. But he was questioned by them about an order that had been received by telephone earlier the same day. And they expected something to arrive in paper, but it didn't. It wasn't among the dispatches that Colin brought with him. That earlier call had come from the Grange in Newport on Staplers Road. It's still there. It was the HQ for the NFS during the war. It's now a care home, but pretty much structurally unchanged. That order from acting column officer Hector Percy Scott, who's on the left of your screen, was that each district should go out and check that any buildings of heritage should be checked for its fire protection and firefighting apparatus. This is a very strange and out of the blue message that just got tongues wagging, I guess. And so when Colin turned up from some subdivisional headquarters with his dispatches, he was questioned about it. But he wasn't able to give them any more information than what he'd heard. And that was the same as what they'd got by telephone. But it does seem a strange message. There were lots of rumours that something was about to happen on the island at the time. The Guards Division had just arrived, creating a lot of interest. Obviously, we had the Polish warship in for a refit. But it was a busy place and created a lot of activity that the Germans would not have missed. It was a very fine day by all accounts on the 4th of May, and pretty quiet. There was a red alert early in the morning, but it didn't come to anything. And it wasn't until quite late at night that the first guns, AA guns, were heard. This is from Captain Frankie's report. At 22:55 that night, they heard guns firing somewhere towards the east of the island. We believe that was the Nettleston battery, which claimed a kill quite early on during the night. But nevertheless, 5 minutes later, he gave the alarm on board for his men to go to action stations. And within 15 minutes, as described and taken from the ship's log, that the ship was surrounded by fires on either side of the Medina. At this stage, his guns were in action, and he'd also deployed some of his men to create smoke to shroud the local area, which they did very well. And those that weren't engaged in those tasks were then sent ashore on both sides to do what they could to assist either medically at Northwood House, where the ARP were rallying the injured, or at East Cowes Town Hall, where a very similar thing was going on, and some directly got involved with the firefighting. Now, at this stage, it was quite serious, but not devastating. However, the raid was sustained until, according to Captain Frankie, 20 minutes past midnight, by which time the place was aglow and a great deal of devastation and death. And some of the particular stories that I've included in the relevant chapter in one of my books are quite heartrending. And I was very, very fortunate that people were so open in providing those snippets of family diaries and memoirs and things that people recalled from this night. Some of whom, many of whom, are not with us today, unfortunately, but their memories are. So Hector Percy Scott over there on the left, the reason I put him there is because he was a young man at the time. He was even younger in the picture. The picture you see, he was a young fireman of Newport Borough Fire Brigade. That was taken around about 1932-33. His father, Sidney Percy Scott, was the chief officer at the time. Hector was a natural fireman and very soon became the second engineer of the brigade, which for someone of his age was quite an achievement. His father retired in the late 30s, and then very soon afterwards we had the formation of the National Fire Service. The NFS appointed a chap in charge of Fire Force 14D, which is the Isle of Wight, 14 Delta, but he got on the wrong side of a lot of people and was taken away and demoted and sent elsewhere. And Hector, being a bright young man, which is what the NFS seemed to prefer, was appointed acting column officer. Now, this isn't many years since he'd been a fireman, so it was a massive step up for him. Now, he still lived with his parents in Medina Avenue in Newport and was called to the Grange as this attack started because he was the senior fireman on the island, so he had to take command. Quite a huge step for a chap who was 31 years old and with some experience, but nothing like the experience he required this night. What was typical of the training for commanders at the time in the fire service was to shuttle resources towards the place that was, the centre of activity. Clearly, fire brigades or the NFS in Cowes and East Cowes would have been the first to respond, assisted by those that were still at Osborne House at the time, by J.S. Wight's Works Brigade and SARO, who are only supposed to respond within their own locale, their own units, but did so much more besides on this occasion and on several others. However, there was an intention to bring more NFS in, so as Newport moved in, resources from West Wight were moved in towards Newport, and things started to encroach on the area, but trying to leave some resources elsewhere just in case there was a secondary attack. So that attack finished 20 minutes after midnight, and there was no time to breathe a sigh of relief as such, because there was so much work going on that the thumping of pumps, fire pumps, just the noise of the blaze, the occasional collapse. At the time, the Isle of Wight had around 50 firefighting pumps assigned to it, which is incomprehensible. Today we have 12, and 50 is an incredible number for this small island to have. Many of those weren't fire engines as such, they were trailer pumps, but nevertheless their ability to deliver water is comparable. It makes no difference. So there was a massive capacity to fight the fire, and more were being called for and sent. The ARP were immensely busy as well, and the chap over on the right hand side is Sidney Burchell, who was the coordinator up at Northwood House for District 3, which was the north of the island, and he carried on at his post despite receiving the news that his home had been struck by a bomb and his wife killed, and his son's whereabouts, his young son's whereabouts at the time, were unknown. Thankfully, that young son did survive and was reunited with his father 2 days later. And it was 2 days later because Sidney refused to leave his post. He didn't stop, he didn't sleep, he just kept working at his post while he was needed. His story is not untypical either, of the type of commitment that was undertaken by so many people that night, be they Polish, French, from all over the world, and of course our own island community. And Hector and Sidney were two of the most notables, at least as much as their story was recorded in various official documents that again I unearthed at the National Archives. However, because the raid stopped, it did give them a chance to actually make some gains on the fire without things worsening, and begin to set up some water relays. Water relays requires masses of hose and more pumps to reach fires further afield. The Medina is a wonderful source of water, but it needed to be moved some considerable distances because the mains water lines were smashed, the trunks were smashed, and it was key for Hector to keep those water flows going via the relays. One of his first moves, and quite rightly, was to contact his regional command over in Hampshire and request more resources, which he was promised would arrive. For whatever reason, they didn't arrive until 8 o'clock the next morning, when really it was beyond the point they were a great deal of help. But nevertheless, what we had here on the island was doing well until it got to the stage when the second raid came in, which, according to Captain Frankie, began at 04:15 in the morning. And at that point, Hector had no choice but to do the one thing he didn't want to do, and that was to send every single firefighting resource from the Isle of Wight to the either Cowes or East Cowes, and leave nothing in reserve. Nothing was left in reserve at all. The only people, one of whom wrote quite poignantly, that were left behind were the ladies in the control rooms of the subdivisional controls, typically Ryde, Shanklin, Newport, who were then just left with empty stations and no job to do because there was nobody left to dispatch. Now at that time, because of the weight of the force, Hector was controlled in something like 800 members of the National Fire Service. For a man of his age and experience to be able to do that and coordinate that, I find that incredible. I know how difficult it can be at times to control 30 people at an incident as a level 1 commander. So to take that on amidst those conditions, and also having received the news that Medina Avenue in Newport, where his parents lived, had taken a few strikes as well, and to work through that and carry on resolutely is incredible. The second raid didn't last quite so long, just over an hour, and the last raider cleared the island skies by about 20 past 5 in the morning. And so a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours later, the exhausted island firemen were relieved by those from the mainland. I say relieved, they weren't actually leave the fire ground. Most of them still had jobs to do, but at least they had some support. The telling thing was about the second raid was that this is where Colin Weeks and his best friend Herbert Dewey lost their lives. They were working near Marvin's Yard, and Captain Heller, who was or at that time, I beg your pardon, Company Officer Heller of the NFS, he was Ryde's pre-war chief officer. He had told certain members of his crew, right, take the opportunity, go and get yourself a cup of tea and a bun. And there was a WVS van parked at the corner, which they headed for, manned by a Mrs. Alice Han, who ran the butcher's shop in Clarence Road. And despite the commandant of the WVS, Mrs. Cheetham, advising her that she should withdraw at the height of the attack, she refused to do so that she could sustain those that were working on the ground in the rescues and firefighting. So that was where Colin and Henry went. They went to her van. And sadly, that's where they were when the second attack, which was unexpected, suddenly appeared out of the sky, and they were caught by one of the first sticker bombs that were dropped in the second wave. And that's how and where they died, along with Mrs. Han, who was taken with them. And there was a guy called Cecil Wright, who later became quite a learned historian at Coventry University, who lived nearby at the time. He was just a young boy, and he clearly remembers when they emerged from their shelter the next morning, seeing the twisted and charred wreckage of the chassis of the WVS van, and that was how close he was to their action. So the worst of it having been over by the time the last raider left, the incident itself was by no means over. Certainly from original records, I know that a crew from Ryde came home for a short period, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and had a bite to eat and probably a bit of a wash, and then turned around and had to go straight back because the fires were still raging in several areas. And so the incident, while we think of it as an attack, started just before 11 o'clock one night and finished just after 5 in the morning. 6 hours created a much larger incident that both the ARP and the NFS were left to deal with for a long, long time, and really didn't finish until the 7th of May, in the evening of the 7th of May. I could go on for hours about this subject, but I think I'd better start to wrap up there, Jeff.
Yes, I think so. We've got one more request, but I think really I know that you could probably do 5 hours worth on this at least. So I'd like to thank you for the moment. The last question, if I can just ask briefly whether you've got enough to say in a couple of minutes about the freshwater Rover Scouts.
Oh yeah, let's find that one.
Well, and we'll finalise with that one, I think.
Yeah, sure. That's a lovely story, actually. I can't remember the number. What number? Just to show you the pictures as well. 19. Right. Let me just find it for you. Okay, the Rover Scouts. This is important. Like I said, prior to 1938, there was no requirement for the local authorities to provide a firefighting force, and so west of Newport there was absolutely nothing for most of the period that I researched, until these young chaps from Freshwater decided to form the Rover Scouts in about 1927-28. The chap in the sort of image on the left-hand side, a bit grainy, I'm afraid, but in the centre there is Wilfred Jeffrey of Honour and Jeffrey fame, who I'm sure we all use the garden centre from time to time. He was the scoutmaster, and his scouts, those that had turned 18 or about to and become too old for traditional scouting, decided, what can we do? We don't want to give up everything that we're doing, so they decided to form a fire brigade. It was a need in the West Wight, without a doubt. So many properties, so many reports in island papers prior to this time remark on how people just had to stand back and watch their homes their businesses, their stock, hayricks, etc., just burned to a cinder because there was no response. Sometimes there was from Newport, but because of insurance issues, there were times when even the brigade that was sent would turn around and go back when they found out the fire wasn't insured. So the Rover Scouts were a breath of fresh air and were much supported in actual fact by the IWFBF, because the year they formed, they were invited to attend the competition, the annual competition that was held at Shanklin, not to participate, but to experience, not to be subjected to the competition itself. That wouldn't have been fair, but to experience what was going on. And many of the organised brigades, if you like, donated some equipment to them. The interesting thing is the photograph in dead centre uppermost. The fire engine that they are manually pulling there is the same one that was used at Newport in 1892 that I talked about earlier and is now parked in our training centre at Wight. This engine's had a lot of use. By the late 20s, Newport were into the motor age and they had no use for it. So they donated that to the Rover Scouts. And they fought some really quite tremendous fires. The one thing I've never seen is if anyone ever equipped them with clothing. I hate to think they did it in shirt sleeves and shorts, but if they did, all more credit to them, because they dealt with some extreme fires, both in freshwater itself and the outlying areas. One of those among that crowd pulling at the manual engine is Herbert Foss. The picture lower centre, you'll see a chap in a kind of one-piece suit to the right-hand side. That's Herbert many years later when he was the training officer for Saro's Works Fire Brigade. This image was taken during the war, and he had a great deal of success both with the Rover Scouts, with what he learned there, and what he then took with him to train the Works firefighters, who, as I mentioned earlier, went above and beyond during the Cows Blitz and other incidents throughout that period. The Rover Scouts themselves weren't just content with being the fire brigade. They wanted, they were, like I say, they were given a lot of equipment, but they wanted to be better. So they did a lot of fundraising, put in a lot of effort to buy themselves new hose, new branches. A branch is the nozzle bit on the end, that's fire brigade speak, and to make sure that they were efficient. And the captain of Newport, Nicholas Marcel, he was very complimentary. Newport showed up to assist them at a fire involving the cinema in Freshwater one particular occasion, and he was highly complimentary of the initial tactics that the Rover Scouts had undertaken to ensure that the fire didn't spread, which it did not, so they were successful. They remained in force until the late 30s when the local authority decided, right, now we need to take the initiative. Everybody knew that the Act, the 1938 Act, was coming, so Freshwater and Totland Parish Council got ahead of the game and formed the Joint Fire Brigade. But the backbone of the brigade even then was the Rover Scouts. And it's a lovely story. It's another one I could talk about for hours about the specifics. But suffice it to say, they were the first firefighting force to the west of the island, the only one for a very long time, and did some remarkable service. All right, Jeff?
Yeah, thank you very much, Damon. That's been really interesting, and I'm sure everybody else thought so too. Unfortunately, I mean, unless you open your screen up, you can probably see everybody sitting in their armchairs. And you can't really react with them, but I'd just like to thank you on their behalf. Your material which you sent, which I copied to everybody, does give your website and also the books which you have got for sale. So I'd just like to remind anybody, if you're not going to do it yourself, Damon, that the presentation tonight was on behalf of the Fire Brigades charity, and we as a society will make a donation directly to that charity as a recompense for the time that Damon has put into this. Obviously, Damon could talk for a long time, and maybe you could perhaps do another talk for us in the future and pick out some more of the subjects which you've not been able to talk about tonight. So thank you very much, everybody. I won't invite anybody to ask any more questions. It's now getting on a bit in the evening. So again, thank you very much, Damon, and we'll be in touch with you just to clear everything up. And as I said earlier at the beginning, I am recording this, so I'll check to see how well it has come out. And if it's good enough, then I'll pass it on to you, Damon. We might well be able to put it on our website so that more of our members can see this and hear what you had to say.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you again.